Article June 15th by What Does It Mean? It's an article by Sorchafal, and the title is Russia Deploys Feared EMP, Electromagnetic Pulse Weapons, Orders Troops to Staggered Defense Positions. The Ministry of Defense is reporting today that President Putin has authorized an immediate wartime deployment of the Federation's most feared and secretive weapons that include axial Virkator-driven pulsed electric beam accelerators, able to instantly defeat all aerial threats, and high-power microwave HPM E-bombs, cruise missiles, and artillery shells that use an enormous electromagnetic radio pulse to disable computers, electronics, vehicles, guided missiles, and communications while leaving people and structures unharmed. This report further states that President Putin has ordered the Federation's nearly 2 million active-duty military forces and federal security personnel to begin dispersing to their staggered defense positions in order to protect these vital defenders from an anticipated nuclear first strike scenario feared to be launched against Russia by the Obama regime and its allies. Most astounding to read is this Ministry of Defense report is that not only has President Putin ordered the deployment of these much feared weapons, he has further authorized that one of them, the super high frequency SHF cannon, be demonstrated tomorrow. This was written on the 15th, so tomorrow would be 16th. It's already been demonstrated to certain Western powers during the closed part of the international event Army 2015, organized by the Defense Ministry, the Federal Space Agency Roscosmos, and the State Technology Corporation Rostec. To the capabilities of the SHF weapon to be demonstrated to the West, a Kremlin-authorized public report states that it creates an air exclusion zone within a reported radius of over 10 kilometers around the defended object or installation, though the system's exact characteristics are classified. This mobile microwave irradiation complex performs off-frequency rejection of electronics aboard low-altitude aerial targets and warheads of high-precision weapons, a source in Rostec told TASS, that's the Russian news agency, adding this system puts close-range air defenses on a whole new level. In terms of performance capabilities, the complex has no competitors in the world, the source said. All the equipment is mounted on a tracked Buk missile air defense transportation platform. Equally as fearsome as the SHF weapon, this report continues, are the explosively pumped flux compressor generators, EPFCG bombs, missiles, and artillery shells being deployed, which if used would electronically devastate vast areas of both the United States and the European Union. As to why President Putin has issued these war orders, this report explains, can best be summed up in the statement he made last week prior to his visit to Italy, wherein he said, "I think that only an insane person and only in a dream can imagine that Russia would suddenly attack NATO. I think some countries are simply taking advantage of people's fears with regard to Russia. They just want to play the role of frontline countries that should receive some supplementary military, economic, financial, or some other aid. But I invite you to publish a world map and mark all the US military bases on them. Then you will see the difference between Russia and America." Even worse, this report continues, the Obama regime desire for war against the Federation of Russia is so all-consuming that aside from their continued massive propaganda smears, they have now actually begun polling both the US and EU public on their desire for such a horrific conflict. And as we can read, as reported by the WSWS News Service, quote, "The findings of a poll published yesterday by the Washington, D.C.-based Pew Research Center showing broad opposition in Europe to a NATO war with Russia underscore the anti-democratic character of the US-led war drive against Russia over Ukraine. The poll was formulated to elicit answers as favorable as possible to US and NATO policy, particularly in regard to a possible war with Russia. The poll questionnaire did not once raise that Russia and NATO both have nuclear weapons or inquire about the respondents' willingness to risk nuclear war. As a result, the poll vastly underestimates public opposition to war. The main question on war was whether NATO member states should fight a defensive war against Russia. If Russia got into a serious military conflict with one of its neighboring countries that is our NATO ally, in such a situation, Article 5 of the NATO Charter on collective self-defense would require all NATO member states to declare war on Russia. Despite having framed the question in a manner intended to elicit support for such a supposedly defensive war, the Pew poll found broad opposition among Europeans. 58% of Germans, 53% of the French population, and 51% of Italians opposed fighting even a defensive war with Russia to protect a NATO member. This is not, however, the character of the war that now threatens to erupt. NATO is not playing a defensive role in Ukraine, which is not a NATO member state. The Ukrainian crisis erupted after the US and the European powers backed a fascist-led push against a pro-Russian government in Kiev in February 2014, bringing to power an ultra-right regime that launched a civil war against pro-Russian areas of eastern Ukraine. With US and Russian missile forces on heightened alert and NATO land, air, and naval forces engaged in continuous exercises on Russia's borders, the world stands on the verge of a catastrophic war provoked by Washington and its European allies. Equally horrific, the Ministry of Defense experts in this report say, that neither the European or American peoples are being told by their propaganda media establishments about the stage being constructed by the Obama regime for the starting of World War III along the Ukrainian border with the Federation Protecting Republic of the Pridnestrovyan Moldavian Republic, PMR, known to the West simply as Transnistria. As we had reported in our 5th of June report, Putin's orders full military force to break blockade as Western leaders gather at Hitler's castle. The PMR is now surrounded by US-Ukraine NATO forces, leaving nearly 1,500 Federation peacekeepers and 500,000 Russian citizens facing the prospect of mass starvation, as all land access to them has been cut off by the Obama regime and its allies. Well, this Transnistria area is basically the border of southwest uh, towards Moldova. President Putin, of course, has ordered an air bridge be established to supply these Federation forces and citizens, but the Ukrainian regime that these planes have to overfly to reach the PMR is now controlled by the wanted international criminal and a former strongman of Georgia, strongman Mikhail Saakashvili, whom the Ukraine government granted citizenship to and then made the governor of the most volatile region of that embattled nation, and who in 2008 actually started a war against the Federation, which ended in his humiliating defeat. And there's a picture here with him eating his Thai. We all know this man. He's acting like some kind of a retard eating his Thai. And then there's a nice map that you can perhaps understand between Moldova and Ukraine, the Transnistria area. And going back to the article, so volatile has the PMR Ukrainian region become. In fact, this report states, Leonid Ivashov of the International Center for Geopolitical Analysis warned this past week that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's intention to deploy air defense systems on the border with the PMR clearly pursues the aim of dragging Russia into another regional conflict to which NATO might be a party, which should certainly ring the alarm bell for the EU countries. As to why the Obama regime and its allies actually want to start world war with the Federation, this report warns, is to further the historic and massive deception they have perpetrated upon all of their citizens with the lies that the global economy is fine, but which last week massive bond market failures where the US, EU billionaires and bankers lost staggering $1.2 trillion shows the sheer insanity of their motives and goals. Now to how close war may be, the Ministry of Defense experts in this report grimly warn, it appears to be much sooner than later, as this past week the US flooded Ukraine with more troops, vehicles and weapons to be stationed on the border with the PMR, while at the same time thousands of more US troops are in preparation for full-scale warfare of a grand scope with clear lines of battle. These days, according to US press reports, the US Army calls it decisive action. Before that, it has been called high-intensity combat and maneuver warfare, but now it is a new regime that is focused on conquering territory, smashing enemy positions, and fighting to win rather than fighting to win hearts and minds. In other words, total war. When one of America's top political news sources, The Nation, begins to write headlines warning, "Why is Washington still pushing for war with Russia?" and a propaganda-confused American public begins saying that they are now ready to go to war with Russia, this Ministry of Defense report concludes it is no wonder that 2 German police officers tasked with guarding these Western leaders at last week's G7 summit are in trouble after they broadcast via private radios the infamous 1943 speech in which Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels asks a large audience gathered in Berlin, "Do you want total war?" At least these 2 German police officers who were in the presence of the Western warmongers were paying attention and know what's going to happen next as total war nears. Does anyone else? So I'll leave a link below for you for this article.